Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're looking at something a little bit different.
Okay.
It's a children's picture book
All right.
called Zoo by Anthony Browne.
Interesting.
And now, before you go thinking picture book, really, this one is special, and not only because it won a prestigious Kate Greenaway medal for its illustrations, but there's a whole research outline dedicated to unpacking
Wow.
its themes and symbolism.
Okay.
Have you ever gotten the feeling that there's more going on beneath the surface at the zoo?
Yeah.
Well, Anthony Browne kind of takes us on this journey to uncover just that from multiple perspectives.
Anthony Browne, I mean, he's really a master at taking these complex ideas and weaving them into these seemingly simple narratives.
Right.
And in Zoo, he uses this family's visit to kind of explore some pretty profound themes about captivity and freedom and our relationship with the natural world.
Right. And speaking of the family, let's meet our main characters. We've got Dad, who's described as large and a bit grumpy, the kind of dad who loves a bad joke.
I know, the type.
Then there's Mom, who comes across as quiet and maybe even a little sad.
Okay.
And of course, we can't forget the two bickering brothers.
Yeah, so, and it's interesting that we only know the younger brother's name.
Right.
Harry.
Yes.
Our narrator, the older brother, remains nameless throughout the story.
Yeah.
What you make of that choice you've been digging through this outline?
I think it adds to the feeling that we're seeing the zoo and the family dynamics through this one child's very specific lens. You know, it really emphasizes that whole idea of perspective. And it made me wonder if, the lack of a name for the narrator encourages us to place ourselves in his shoes, to, see the zoo through his eyes.
That's a great point. And when you consider how the family behaves at the zoo, it really makes you question who's truly caged.
Right.
I mean, they find some of the animals boring. They focus more on, lunch and souvenirs, you know?
Right.
It's almost as if they're missing the point entirely.
It's like they're so caught up in their own little world, their own routines, that they can't fully appreciate the wonder of the animals that are right in front of them. And I've definitely been guilty of that myself, maybe even more so as an adult than as a child.
Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate to that.
Yeah.
And Browne doesn't shy away from highlighting that disconnect. There's a particularly striking illustration where the family is looking at the baboons, but they're separated from the animals by what looks like barbed wire.
Oh, wow.
What are your thoughts on that imagery?
Wow. Yeah.
It seems pretty significant, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think it really drives home that theme of captivity, but it flips the script. Instead of the animals being caged, it's the family behind bars. And it makes me think about how we sometimes create our own cages through our attitudes and our routines.
Yeah.
Maybe even fear of the unknown.
And if we consider Mom's earlier comment about how the baboons remind her of someone, it adds another layer to that image. Perhaps she feels trapped in her own life, maybe in her role as a wife and a mother.
Right.
Definitely sparks a lot of questions about the different forms that captivity can take.
For sure. And it's not just the adults who seem disconnected. The outline mentions how one of the boys mimics the gorilla's posture. And I thought that was really interesting. It seemed like a moment of connection, but also a bit unsettling.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yes. That scene is very open to interpretation. I mean, on one hand, it could be seen as a child's innocent attempt to relate to the animal, to find some common ground.
Yeah.
But there's also this sense of mirroring, of reflecting back the gorilla's own captivity. And it raises questions about our tendency to anthropomorphize animals, to project our own feelings and experiences onto them.
Yeah. Makes you wonder how much of what we see at the zoo is really like a reflection of ourselves. Do we truly connect with the animals, or are we seeing what we want to see?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and I think it gets to the heart of what Browne is exploring in Zoo. He's challenging us to consider the power dynamics at play, not just between humans and animals, but also within our own families and social structures.
Speaking of those power dynamics, I couldn't help but notice the way Dad is portrayed in the book. The outline mentions that he's described using some animalistic words like roared and snarled. It's almost as if he's one of the exhibits himself.
Absolutely. I mean, that's such a clever use of language by Browne.
Right.
By describing Dad this way, he blurs the lines between human and animal and forces us to question who's really in control, who is observing whom.
Right.
It also highlights the potential for aggression and dominance within family relationships.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the impact that kind of behavior can have on others, especially the more quiet members of the family like Mom and the nameless narrator.
Right.
They almost seem overshadowed by Dad's larger-than-life presence.
And that kind of brings us to the ending of the book, which I found particularly powerful.
Okay.
The image of the boy in his room with the window's shadow casting bars on the floor.
Yeah.
So haunting, it really stays with you.
It does. It reinforces that sense of confinement for me, that the idea that even when we leave the zoo,
Yeah.
those feelings of captivity can linger. It's almost as if the experience has left an imprint on the boy's psyche, you know, making him question his own freedom.
It's a brilliant way to end the story because it doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
Browne leaves us to grapple with those complex feelings and to consider the lasting impact of our interactions with the natural world.
And it makes you wonder, are any of us truly free? Are we all just navigating our own cages?
Yeah.
Both literal and figurative?
That's a big question, and one that Browne seems to be asking throughout his work.
Yeah.
The outline mentioned a couple of his other books, Gorilla and Piggy Book, that also explores similar themes of family dynamics and animal imagery and the blurred lines between human and animal behavior. Have you had a chance to read either of those?
I haven't yet, but they're definitely on my list now.
Okay.
It's fascinating how Browne consistently uses animals to hold a mirror up to ourselves, to reveal our own complexities and contradictions.
He's a master of that, and it's interesting that he actually worked as a medical illustrator before becoming a children's book author. Perhaps that background gave him a unique perspective on the human form and its connection to the natural world.
That makes a lot of sense. You can definitely see that attention to detail in his illustrations.
Yeah.
The way he captures both the beauty and the vulnerability of his subjects.
Speaking of the illustrations, I wanted to go back to that barbed wire image for a moment.
Right.
What's so striking about it is that it's not immediately obvious. You have to look closely to see it.
Right.
Which makes me think it's a subtle but powerful commentary on the hidden cages we often construct for ourselves.
It's like a visual metaphor for the ways in which we limit our own experiences, whether through fear, societal expectations, or simply a lack of awareness.
Exactly, and that ties back to the theme of perspective that we were talking about earlier, the way we see the world.
Yeah.
And the cages we perceive are often shaped by our own individual experiences and biases.
It makes you wonder what the other members of the family see when they look at that same image.
Yeah.
Do they notice the barbed wire?
Right.
Do they feel confined in the same way that the narrator does?
It's impossible to know for sure, but that's part of the beauty of Browne's work. He invites us to fill in the gaps,
Right.
to consider the multiple perspectives at play, and to draw our own conclusions.
And those conclusions might vary depending on our own backgrounds and experiences.
Exactly.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of story.
Right.
Which makes me think that Zoo would be a great book to discuss with others.
Yeah.
To hear different interpretations and insights.
I completely agree. It's the kind of book that sparks conversation and encourages deeper thinking, which is what we're all about here on the Deep Dive.
Exactly.
And speaking of deeper thinking, I think it's time to kind of zoom out a bit and consider the broader implications of Browne's work.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the family and the illustrations and the symbolism, but what's the bigger picture here?
Right.
What's Browne really trying to say about our relationship with the natural world?
Right.
With each other and with ourselves?
Yeah, it feels like Browne is challenging us to look beyond the surface.
Yeah.
To question our assumptions about the world around us and to acknowledge the complexities of our own human nature.
I think that's a great way to put it. He's not offering us simple answers or preaching a particular message. He's just presenting us with a scenario, a family's visit to the zoo.
Right.
And inviting us to explore all the layers of meaning beneath that seemingly ordinary experience.
And what's so fascinating is he does it all through the eyes of a child. It's like children have this innate ability to see the world with a freshness and an honesty that we as adults often lose sight of.
Right. There's a certain rawness to a child's perspective that can be incredibly insightful because they haven't yet learned to filter their observations through those societal expectations or preconceived notions.
Right.
So when the narrator in Zoo points out the boredom, the arguing, the focus on those superficial things, it's a stark reminder of how easily we can become desensitized to the wonders that are all around us.
Like that saying, children see magic because they look for it. And maybe Browne is encouraging us to tap back into that childlike sense of wonder, to rediscover the magic in the everyday.
And to recognize the interconnectedness of all living things. Remember that scene where the boy mirrors the gorilla's posture?
Yeah.
It's a fleeting moment, but it speaks volumes about our shared experiences, our shared vulnerability.
It makes you wonder, do we really see the animals at the zoo as individuals, as fellow beings, or do we view them more as objects,
Yeah.
as entertainment?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? And it's a question that has those ethical implications as well. Like, what is the purpose of zoos? Are they truly for conservation and education, or are they primarily for our own amusement?
And if we're not engaging with these animals on a deeper level,
Hmm.
if we're more interested in burgers and souvenirs than in understanding their lives and their needs, then what does that say about our relationship with the natural world as a whole?
It's a sobering thought, and one that Brown doesn't shy away from. He's not afraid to make us uncomfortable, to challenge our assumptions about our place in the world.
And that's what makes Zoo such a powerful and thought-provoking book. It's not just a children's story. It's a commentary on human nature, on our capacity for both connection and detachment.
And it's a reminder that even seemingly simple things like a trip to the zoo can be layered with meaning and complexity.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the zoo, what's the one takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I'd say the most important thing is to remember that observation is an active process. The way we see the world is shaped by our own experiences and biases and choices.
Right.
So the next time you find yourself at the zoo or really anywhere in nature, take a moment to really look, to listen, and to question your own assumptions. You might be surprised by what you discover.
That's a great challenge for our listeners. Look closer, question more, and stay curious. And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to pick up a copy of Zoo yourself and see what other hidden depths you can uncover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.